welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we drift back to ancient Alexandria, where the last pharaoh of Egypt faced her final, fateful years amid political intrigue and fading power. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. This narration should flow like honey over ancient stone. We're telling the story of history's most famous queen in her final, desperate years. The pace should be meditative, allowing listeners to sink into the world of ancient Alexandria. Use pauses generously to let the imagery settle. The tone should be warm but tinged with the melancholy of inevitable tragedy. This is not just political history, it's deeply human, exploring love, power, motherhood, and the weight of legacy as an empire crumbles. Close your eyes and let your breathing slow. Feel your body settling into comfort as we prepare to journey back through time, across oceans of years, to a world of marble palaces and golden sunlight dancing on the Mediterranean Sea. Tonight, we travel to Alexandria, the jewel of the ancient world, where the scent of frankincense mingles with salt air, where the great lighthouse stands sentinel over harbors filled with ships from every corner of the known world. Here, in the final years of the last Ptolemaic dynasty, we find a woman whose name has echoed through millennia, Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, mother, lover, and the final guardian of a civilization that had flourished for 3,000 years. Picture the sun setting over the harbor, painting the white marble of the royal palace in shades of amber and rose. The year is 34 BCE. The Roman Republic tears itself apart in civil war, and Egypt, wealthy, proud, independent Egypt, stands at the crossroads of destiny. Feel yourself drifting backward through time, past the rise and fall of empires, past the lives of countless souls who walk these same streets, breathe this same air. Tonight, you are a silent observer in the final act of one of history's greatest dramas. Let the weight of the present world fall away as we enter the twilight of the pharaohs. In the 35th year of her life, Cleopatra VII Philopator stood on the balcony of her palace, gazing out over Alexandria as the first light of dawn touched the harbor waters. The year was 34 BCE, and the weight of 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule pressed upon her shoulders like a mantle of gold and lead. She had been queen for 15 years, had loved Caesar, had borne him a son, had watched him die on the Ides of March. Now she loved another Roman, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, and their fates were becoming as intertwined as the sacred serpents on her crown. The morning air carried the familiar sounds of her city awakening, the calls of merchants setting up their stalls in the agora, the rhythmic splash of oars as fishing boats returned with the night's catch, the distant chanting from the great temple of Serapis. Alexandria was more than just her capital, it was the last free Hellenistic city in a world increasingly dominated by Roman eagles. Here, Greek philosophy mingled with Egyptian mysticism, Jewish scholarship flourished alongside pagan temples, and the greatest library in the world held the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Cleopatra moved through her morning rituals with the practiced grace of one born to rule. Her servants, silent and efficient, helped her dress in the finest linen, dyed with precious purple from Phoenician murex shells. Each fold of fabric, each piece of jewelry, each cosmetic applied to her face was chosen not merely for beauty but for meaning. She was not just a woman preparing for her day, she was the living embodiment of Isis, the goddess queen whose very appearance reinforced her divine right to rule Egypt. The palace itself was a marvel that would have impressed even Roman senators accustomed to luxury. Corridors lined with columns of porphyry and granite led to rooms decorated with frescoes depicting the glories of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Gardens filled with exotic plants from across the empire provided cool retreats from the Mediterranean sun. The famous dining hall, where she had once entertained Caesar and where she now shared meals with Antony, could accommodate hundreds of guests beneath a ceiling painted with constellations that matched the night sky. But beneath the splendor lay the constant awareness of vulnerability. Egypt was wealthy, its grain-fed Rome, its gold-filled treasuries, its craftsmen created wonders that were coveted across the known world. Yet this very wealth made it a prize that ambitious Romans eyed hungrily. Cleopatra understood, with the sharp intelligence that had made her a worthy heir to the throne of the pharaohs, that her kingdom's independence hung by threads as delicate as silk. She thought often of her ancestors in these morning hours. The first Ptolemy had been one of Alexander the Great's generals, and when the young conqueror died in Babylon, Ptolemy had claimed Egypt as his prize. For 3 centuries, his descendants had ruled from Alexandria, maintaining the old Egyptian customs while embracing Greek culture and learning. They had built the lighthouse, one of the seven wonders of the world. They had made their capital a beacon of civilization that drew scholars, artists, and merchants from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Now she was the last. Her brother husband Ptolemy XIV had died. Some whispered she had poisoned him, as was the way of their dynasty when succession was uncertain. Her son Caesarion, born of her union with Julius Caesar, was 13 years old and showed promise, but he was still too young to rule if anything happened to her. Her younger children by Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus were still infants, their futures uncertain in a world where royal blood could be both blessing and curse. The morning sun climbed higher, and Cleopatra could see the harbor filling with ships. Some carried grain to Rome, the tribute that kept her kingdom nominally independent. Others brought goods from the Red Sea trade routes that made Egypt wealthy, spices from India, silk from distant China, precious stones and ivory from the upper reaches of the Nile. But increasingly, she noticed ships bearing Roman standards, reminders that her independence existed only at the pleasure of Roman power. A servant approached with the morning's correspondence, scrolls sealed with wax bearing the marks of officials from Memphis, Thebes, and the frontier towns near Nubia. Each scroll represented decisions to be made, problems to be solved, the endless administrative work of ruling a kingdom that stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the cataracts of the Nile. Cleopatra read Egyptian hieroglyphs as easily as Greek letters, spoke the languages of her diverse subjects, and understood both the ancient traditions that legitimized her rule and the modern political realities that threatened it. One scroll brought particularly troubling news from the eastern frontier. Roman agents were said to be stirring up trouble among the Nabatean Arabs, traditional allies of Egypt. Another reported unrest in Upper Egypt, where priests complained about the burden of taxation needed to pay tribute to Rome. A third contained intelligence from her spies in Rome itself, describing the growing power of Octavian, Julius Caesar's heir and adopted son, who was systematically eliminating his rivals in the ongoing civil war that was tearing the Roman Republic apart. Cleopatra set down the scrolls and walked to a window that looked inland, toward the great river that was the lifeblood of her kingdom. She could see the brown waters of the Nile in the distance, carrying their burden of fertile silt that had made Egypt the granary of the Mediterranean for millennia. Her ancestors had called themselves pharaohs, god-kings who maintained Ma'at, the divine order that kept the floods coming, the crops growing, the stars in their courses. She carried that responsibility now, the last link in a chain of rulers that stretched back to the legendary Menes, the first pharaoh to unite Upper and Lower Egypt. The weight of that history, that responsibility, never left her. Even in her most private moments, even when she held her children or lay in Antony's arms, she remained acutely aware that she was not just Cleopatra the woman but Cleopatra the queen, the last pharaoh, the living goddess whose decisions would determine whether 3,000 years of Egyptian independence would continue or whether her kingdom would become merely another Roman province. The afternoon heat had settled over Alexandria like a golden blanket when Marcus Antonius returned from his inspection of the harbor defenses. Cleopatra watched from her private garden as his galley approached the royal wharf, its bronze ram cutting through water that sparkled like scattered diamonds. Even at a distance, she could recognize his powerful frame, the way he stood at the prow with unconscious authority, every inch the Roman general who had once commanded legions from Gaul to Syria. Their love affair had begun 3 years earlier, in 41 BCE, when she had sailed to meet him at Tarsus. The stories of that meeting had already passed into legend, how she had arrived dressed as Aphrodite, her golden barge perfumed with exotic incense, her beauty and intelligence capturing the heart of the man whom many called the most powerful Roman alive. But the reality had been more complex, more political, and ultimately more genuine than the stories suggested. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his campaigns against Rome's enemies in the east. Cleopatra needed a Roman protector strong enough to guarantee her kingdom's independence. What had begun as a calculated alliance between two rulers had deepened into something neither had expected, a passionate love that transcended the political necessities that had brought them together. She had borne him 3 children, and in quiet moments, when the demands of kingship and generalship fell away, they found in each other an understanding that few people of their exalted positions could ever hope to achieve. As his ship docked, Cleopatra made her way through corridors lined with guards whose loyalty to her was absolute. The Macedonian Guard, descendants of the soldiers who had followed Alexander to Egypt 3 centuries earlier, still maintained their ancestral traditions. Their bronze armor gleamed with the patina of age, their spear points were sharp enough to split silk, and their eyes held the steady gaze of men who had sworn to die before they let harm come to their queen. She found Antony in the Great Hall, still dusty from his tour of the fortifications, speaking in rapid Latin with his subordinate officers. When he saw her approach, his weathered face lit with the smile that had first charmed her at Tarsus, not the practiced smile of a politician, but something genuine and warm that reached his eyes. At 49, he was still a formidable figure, broad-shouldered and strong-armed, his presence filling whatever space he occupied. "My queen," he said, switching effortlessly to Greek, the language they used in private. His accent still carried traces of his Roman origins, but he had learned to speak Egyptian as well, understanding that ruling this ancient land required more than military strength. "The harbor defenses are strong. Any enemy would pay dearly to force their way past our chains and catapults." They walked together to their private chambers, where servants had prepared cool drinks flavored with honey and mint. The room was a blend of their two worlds, Roman furniture mixed with Egyptian artifacts, Greek sculptures alongside hieroglyphic inscriptions, a fusion that reflected their own complicated relationship. Through tall windows, they could see the palace gardens where their children played under the watchful eyes of their tutors and guards. "The dispatches from Rome grow more troubling," Cleopatra said, settling onto a divan upholstered in silk from the distant lands beyond Persia. "Octavian has eliminated Marcus Lepidus from the triumvirate. He controls Italy now, and the western provinces. His power grows while yours." She let the sentence hang in the perfumed air between them. Antony's jaw tightened. The political situation in Rome had deteriorated rapidly since the assassination of Julius Caesar. The Roman Republic, which had once conquered the Mediterranean through military discipline and political unity, was tearing itself apart in a series of civil wars that seemed to have no end. The second triumvirate, the alliance between Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus that had been formed to hunt down Caesar's assassins, was dissolving as each man pursued his own ambitions. The irony was bitter. Antony had spent years fighting Rome's enemies, winning victories that expanded the empire's borders and filled its treasuries. He had defeated the Parthians at multiple battles, had secured the eastern provinces that provided much of Rome's wealth, had maintained peace with client kingdoms from Armenia to Judea. Yet in the corridors of power in Rome, Octavian's supporters whispered that he had gone native, that he had become more Egyptian than Roman. Cleopatra reached for his hand, feeling the calluses left by decades of wielding swords and holding shields. "Perhaps," she said softly, "the question is not whether you have become less Roman, but whether Rome has become something neither of us recognizes. The republic your ancestors built was based on honor, on virtue, on service to the state. What is Octavian offering? Personal rule disguised as restoration?" They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two of the most powerful people in the world contemplating the forces that were slowly but inexorably closing around them. Outside, the sounds of Alexandria continued, merchants calling their wares, children laughing in the streets, the eternal rhythm of a great city going about its daily life. But both knew that this peaceful scene existed only because of the delicate balance of power that kept Octavian's legions at bay. "I have been thinking," Antony said eventually, "about the donation ceremony we discussed. If we are to face Octavian eventually, and I believe we must, then we need to present a united front. Egypt and Rome, East and West, joined not in submission but in partnership. The donations of Alexandria, the grand ceremony they were planning, would be a bold political statement. Antony would formally grant territories to Cleopatra and their children, presenting himself not as a Roman governor extracting tribute but as a generous ruler sharing power with his beloved queen. Cleopatra would appear not as a client suppliant but as an equal partner in governing the eastern Mediterranean. It was a dangerous gamble. Such a ceremony would provide Octavian with powerful propaganda material. Here was proof, he would claim, that Antony had betrayed Rome for the sake of a foreign woman. But it might also demonstrate to the eastern provinces that Antony offered them something Octavian could not: partnership rather than domination, cultural respect rather than Roman arrogance. "The children must be prepared," Cleopatra said, thinking of her son Caesarion and the 3 young ones she had with Antony. "They will be players in this game whether we wish it or not. Better that they understand their roles than stumble into tragedy through innocence." Watching her children, Cleopatra felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever she contemplated their future. Royal children had always faced dangers: assassination, imprisonment, exile were common fates for the offspring of deposed rulers. But these children carried an additional burden. They were the potential heirs to both Egyptian and Roman power, their very existence a challenge to anyone who sought to rule either kingdom absolutely. Sometimes, she whispered, so softly that Antony had to lean close to hear her, I wonder if love is a luxury we cannot afford. Every choice we make from the heart gives our enemies weapons to use against us. Every happiness we steal from the present might cost our children their future. Antony's arm tightened around her shoulders. Then we must make sure, he said with the quiet determination that had made him one of Rome's greatest generals, that when our enemies come for us, they find us ready. Egypt has survived for 3,000 years by adapting to each new threat. We will not be the generation that lets it fall. The preparations for the great ceremony consumed the entire palace for weeks. Craftsmen worked day and night in workshops that had not seen such activity since the coronation of Cleopatra herself 15 years earlier. Gold leaf was applied to towering columns, silk banners were sewn with threads so fine they seemed spun from light itself, and precious stones were set into ceremonial objects that would transform the already magnificent palace into something approaching the realm of the gods. Cleopatra stood in her private chamber as her most trusted servants helped her prepare for the ceremony that would change everything. The costume she would wear had been designed to send a message as clear as any battle cry. She appeared as Isis, the mother goddess whose worship had spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Her gown was of the finest linen, so pure it seemed to glow with inner light, pleated and draped in the ancient Egyptian style that had changed little in millennia. Upon her head rested a crown that combined the traditional uraeus serpent with the horns and sun disk of Hathor, marking her as both pharaoh and goddess incarnate. The weight of the regalia was considerable. Gold was heavy, and the precious stones that adorned her crown, necklaces, and bracelets represented the wealth of kingdoms. But Cleopatra had been trained from childhood to bear such burdens with grace. Each piece of jewelry, each fold of fabric, each cosmetic line drawn around her eyes had symbolic meaning that would be read and interpreted by the thousands who would witness the ceremony and the millions more who would hear of it throughout the eastern Mediterranean. In the great throne room, workers were making final adjustments to the two thrones that had been specially constructed for the occasion. Antony's was Roman in style but made from Egyptian gold, its arms carved with eagles that bore both Roman standards and Egyptian ankhs. Cleopatra's throne was even more magnificent, a masterwork of ivory and gold that seemed to float above the dais like a cloud given solid form. Between them stood smaller thrones for their children, each crafted to reflect their new titles and territories. The guest list represented a careful balance of political necessities and diplomatic opportunities. Ambassadors from every client kingdom in the east had been invited, along with representatives from the Roman colonies and allied cities. The message was clear. This was not merely an Egyptian ceremony but a gathering of all those who looked to Antony as their patron and protector. The absence of any representatives from Octavian's faction was notable and intentional. This was a declaration of independence from the increasingly autocratic rule emerging in Rome. As the hour approached, Cleopatra made her way through corridors lined with her personal guard to the antechamber where her children waited. The sight of them took her breath away. 13-year-old Caesarion stood tall in robes that marked him as King of Kings, a title that would surely infuriate Octavian but which reflected his status as the son of Julius Caesar. At his age, he was old enough to understand the political implications of the ceremony, and she could see in his dark eyes, so like his father's, both excitement and apprehension. The younger children were a vision of royal magnificence that would have impressed the courts of the greatest ancient kings. Alexander Helios, named for the sun, wore Persian-style robes and a tiara that marked him as the future ruler of Armenia and Media. His twin sister, Cleopatra Selene, was dressed as a Hellenistic queen, her costume acknowledging her future rule over Cyrenaica and Libya. Little Ptolemy Philadelphus, barely able to walk steadily under the weight of his miniature royal regalia, would be proclaimed king of Syria and Cilicia. Remember, Cleopatra said softly, kneeling to speak to the twins at their eye level, you are not just children today. You are princes and princesses, the hope of Egypt and the promise of tomorrow. Stand straight, smile when the people cheer, and remember that everything we do today is to ensure that you will rule over a world at peace. The sound of trumpets echoed through the palace, the signal that the ceremony was about to begin. Cleopatra took a deep breath, feeling the familiar transformation that occurred whenever she stepped from private woman to public queen. The doubts, fears, and human emotions that plagued her in quiet moments fell away, replaced by the serene confidence that had made her one of the most effective rulers of her age. The great doors of the throne room opened with a sound like distant thunder, and the assembled dignitaries rose as one. The sight that greeted them was carefully orchestrated to overwhelm the senses and imprint itself permanently on memory. The vast hall blazed with the light of 1,000 oil lamps, their flames reflecting off gold surfaces until the very air seemed to shimmer. Incense burned in braziers throughout the room, filling the space with the sacred sense of myrrh and frankincense that connected this moment to every pharaonic ceremony stretching back to the dawn of Egyptian civilization. Antony entered first, and the Roman elements of the audience could see immediately that he had chosen to present himself as something new in their experience. He wore the purple cloak of Roman Imperium but carried Egyptian symbols of authority. His crown was neither purely Roman nor purely Egyptian but a fusion that suggested a new kind of rule for a new age. When he took his place on his throne, he did so not as a Roman governor ruling conquered territory but as an Eastern king claiming authority equal to any in the Mediterranean world. Then came Cleopatra, and even those who had seen her many times before felt the power of her presence. She moved with the fluid grace of a dancer, but her bearing was that of a goddess. The elaborate makeup around her eyes, the kohl lines that extended to her temples, the gold dust that highlighted her cheekbones transformed her human features into something approaching the divine. When she raised her arms in acknowledgement of the crowd's cheers, the gesture seemed to encompass not just the assembled dignitaries but all of Egypt, the entire Eastern Mediterranean, the very cosmos itself. The children followed in order of age, each playing their part in the grand theater of monarchy. Caesarion walked with the measured pace of one already learning to be a king, while the younger ones managed their roles with the seriousness that only small children can bring to important occasions. When they were all seated on their thrones, the tableau presented a vision of dynastic continuity that stretched from the legendary past into an unlimited future. People of Alexandria, subjects of the great Queen Cleopatra, allies and friends from across the sea, he began, his Latin-accented Greek somehow adding to rather than detracting from the solemnity of the moment. We gather today not merely to celebrate the glory that is Egypt, but to proclaim a new order for the world. An order based not on conquest and exploitation, but on partnership and mutual respect. He gestured toward Cleopatra, who inclined her head with regal grace. Behold Cleopatra, Queen of Kings, rightful Pharaoh of Egypt, beloved of Isis, chosen of the gods. To her I confirm dominion over Egypt and Cyprus, over Crete and parts of Syria, over all the ancient lands that have looked to Alexandria for wisdom and leadership. The crowd roared its approval, but Antony was not finished. And behold these royal children, the hope of tomorrow, the promise that this great civilization will continue to flourish under rulers who understand both strength and mercy. One by one, he proclaimed their titles and territories, each announcement greeted with waves of cheering that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. When the formal proclamations were complete, the ceremony continued with religious rituals that acknowledged both Egyptian and Greek traditions. Priests of Isis and Serapis blessed the royal family, while scholars read from ancient texts that traced the divine lineage of pharaonic authority back to the gods themselves. The blending of traditions was not accidental, it demonstrated that this new order would respect the ancient ways while adapting to modern realities. My people, she began, and those two words carried the weight of 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition. We stand today at a crossroads of history. Behind us lies the wisdom of ages, the achievements of our ancestors who built the pyramids, who mapped the stars, who made this land a beacon of civilization when much of the world lay in darkness. Before us lies a future that we must create together, a future where the ancient glory of Egypt serves not just our own kingdom but becomes a model for all the world. The news of the donations of Alexandria traveled across the Mediterranean with the speed of swift galleys and the inexorability of winter storms. In Rome, the reports reached Octavian in his villa on the Palatine Hill, where he was meeting with his closest advisors to plan the next phase of his campaign to become sole ruler of the Roman world. When the courier finished his breathless recital of events in Alexandria, the room fell silent except for the distant sounds of the eternal city going about its daily business. Octavian set down the scroll he had been reading, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. At 29, he was already a master of political theater who understood that every gesture, every expression, every word would be scrutinized by friends and enemies alike for signs of weakness or strength. The youth who had been merely Gaius Octavius before his adoption by Julius Caesar had learned to present himself as the living embodiment of Roman virtue and tradition, even as he systematically dismantled the republican institutions that had governed Rome for centuries. The men gathered around him, senators, generals, wealthy businessmen who had tied their fortunes to his rising star, murmured their agreement, but Octavian could see the calculation in their eyes. Antony was still a formidable opponent, still commanded the loyalty of veteran legions, still controlled vast wealth and resources. The donations of Alexandria might provide excellent propaganda material, but propaganda alone would not win the coming war. Marcus Agrippa, Octavian's most trusted general and the architect of many of his military victories, leaned forward to study the map of the Mediterranean that dominated one wall of the chamber. The eastern provinces will see this ceremony as a promise of continued autonomy under Antony's protection, he said in his characteristically direct manner. They may prefer his rule to ours, especially if they believe he offers them partnership rather than conquest. Then we must ensure they understand the true nature of his offer, Octavian replied. Antony promises them partnership, but what he delivers is subjugation to Egyptian interests. He has made himself the servant of a foreign queen, and through him, Rome's eastern territories have become the playthings of Alexandria. The propaganda campaign that followed was orchestrated with the same careful attention to detail that Octavian brought to military planning. Throughout Italy, speakers appeared in forum squares to denounce Antony's betrayal of Roman values. Poets were commissioned to write verses celebrating the simple virtues of Roman farmers and soldiers while decrying the decadent luxury of Eastern courts. Coins were minted showing Octavian as a stern republican leader contrasted with images of Antony in Eastern dress, kneeling before Cleopatra's throne. But the most devastating weapon in Octavian's arsenal was Antony's will, which he claimed to have obtained through his network of spies and supporters. Whether the document was genuine or forged, its contents provided exactly the ammunition Octavian needed. According to this will, Antony had left vast Roman territories to Cleopatra and her children, had acknowledged Caesarion as Julius Caesar's legitimate heir, and had requested to be buried in Alexandria rather than in the tombs of his ancestors in Rome. The reading of the will in the Senate created exactly the sensation Octavian had hoped for. Even senators who had been reluctant to support his increasingly autocratic rule were horrified by what they heard. Here was proof, they believed, that Antony had completely abandoned his Roman identity for the sake of his Egyptian mistress. The man who had once been hailed as one of Rome's greatest generals had betrayed his own country for gold and pleasure. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony received their own intelligence reports about the growing hostility in Rome. The Queen's network of informants, merchants, diplomats, scholars who traveled freely between the great cities of the Mediterranean brought word of Octavian's propaganda campaign, of the increasing likelihood that the Roman Senate would declare war on Egypt, of the military preparations that were already beginning in Italy and the western provinces. "They do not dare declare war on you directly," Cleopatra observed as she and Antony walked through the palace gardens in the cool of early morning. "That would be too honest, and honesty has never been Octavian's strength. Instead, they will declare war on me, painting you as the victim of feminine wiles rather than acknowledging you as the rival you truly are." The irony was bitter but politically astute. By focusing their attacks on Cleopatra rather than Antony, Octavian's supporters could maintain the fiction that they were defending Rome against foreign aggression rather than fighting another civil war. Roman citizens were weary of civil conflict after decades of violence and instability. But a war against Egypt, rich, exotic, ruled by a queen who could be portrayed as a threat to Roman values, might rally the public support that Octavian needed. Antony paused beside a fountain where water played over marble carved to resemble lotus flowers, a reminder that they stood at the center of a civilization far older than Rome. "Let them declare war on Egypt," he said, his soldiers' instincts already calculating distances and resources, supply lines, and battle positions. Egypt is not some barbarian kingdom to be conquered by a single campaign. These are the lands of the pharaohs, defended by the Nile and the desert, by wealth accumulated over millennia and by people who remember what it means to be free. But both knew that the coming conflict would be decided not in Egypt but on battlefields that might span the entire Mediterranean. Antony's strength lay in the eastern provinces, in the veteran legions that had followed him through campaigns from Gaul to Parthia, in the wealth of kingdoms and cities that had prospered under his protection. Octavian controlled Italy in the west, but the east was richer, more populous, more strategically valuable in the long term. The challenge would be bringing that eastern strength to bear in a decisive battle before Octavian could consolidate his position in Rome and win over the wavering senators who still remembered the Republic's glory days. Speed would be crucial, as would careful preparation and the maintenance of the alliance between Roman military efficiency and Egyptian wealth that had made their partnership so formidable. Cleopatra's contribution to the coming war would be more than symbolic. Egyptian ships would carry Antony's legions, Egyptian gold would pay his soldiers, Egyptian engineers would construct the siege works and fortifications that might determine victory or defeat. But more than that, her very presence would serve as a constant reminder of what was at stake, not just the fate of two ambitious men, but the question of whether the Mediterranean world would be unified under a single Roman ruler or would remain a diverse collection of allied kingdoms and provinces. As they walked back toward the palace, both were already thinking ahead to the countless decisions that would need to be made in the coming months. Which legions could be trusted absolutely? Which eastern kingdoms would remain loyal if the tide of battle turned against them? How could they coordinate naval and land forces across the vast distances of the Mediterranean? How could they present their cause in terms that would appeal not just to their own followers but to the broader population of the Roman world? The winter of 33 to 32 BCE was one of feverish preparation on both sides of the Mediterranean. In Alexandria, the great harbor that had once been filled primarily with merchant vessels now bristled with warships whose bronze rams gleamed in the Egyptian sun. Shipbuilders worked around the clock in yards that had been expanded to accommodate the largest naval construction project in Egyptian history, while smiths forged weapons and armor for the legions that would soon march to what might be the final battle for control of the Roman world. Cleopatra threw herself into the preparations with an energy that amazed even those who had served her for years. She was present at dawn inspections of the docks, spent long afternoons reviewing supply lists with her quartermasters, and devoted her evenings to meetings with ambassadors and envoys who brought news from across her far-flung network of allies and dependencies. The woman who had once been content to rule Egypt and enjoy the love of Antony had transformed herself into a war leader whose attention extended to every detail of the coming campaign. The royal workshops produced not just weapons and ships but also the symbols and standards that would define their cause in the eyes of the world. Banners were sewn that combined Roman eagles with Egyptian symbols, creating a visual representation of the alliance between East and West that Antony and Cleopatra claimed to represent. Coins were struck showing the two rulers as equal partners, a direct challenge to Octavian's propaganda that portrayed Antony as a subordinate to his foreign mistress. But the preparations went beyond mere military logistics. Cleopatra understood that the coming war would be fought as much with ideas as with swords, and she worked to present their cause in terms that would appeal to the diverse populations of the eastern Mediterranean. This was not merely a struggle between rival Roman generals, she argued, but a battle for the soul of the civilized world. Would the future belong to Octavian's vision of uniform Roman rule, or to their model of partnership between different cultures and traditions? The Queen's most trusted advisors worked to craft messages that would resonate with different audiences across their territories. To the Greek cities of Asia Minor, they emphasized the Hellenistic heritage that Octavian's Romans would surely suppress. To the Jewish communities scattered across the eastern provinces, they pointed to Cleopatra's protection of Jewish rights and traditions. To the native Egyptian population, they stressed the continuity of pharaonic rule and the divine mandate that legitimized their queen's authority. Meanwhile, Antony focused on the military preparations that would determine whether their political messages would have any practical relevance. His war council met daily in a room whose walls were covered with maps showing every significant town, harbor, and mountain pass from the Hellespont to the Sahara. The challenge was enormous: how to coordinate forces spread across thousands of miles, how to maintain supply lines that stretched across seas and deserts, how to time movements so that their scattered legions could come together at the decisive moment. The loyalty of the Eastern legions was not in question. These were veteran units that had followed Antony through years of successful campaigns, had shared in the spoils of victory, had sworn personal oaths of allegiance that transcended any abstract loyalty to Rome. But loyalty alone would not be enough if they could not be brought to the right place at the right time with adequate supplies and support. The naval preparations were particularly crucial, for both leaders understood that the coming war would likely be decided at sea. Egypt had always been more of a naval than a land power, and Cleopatra's fleet was being augmented with ships and crews drawn from every corner of the eastern Mediterranean. Phoenician shipwrights brought their ancient expertise, Greek sailors contributed their knowledge of currents and winds, while Egyptian marines trained in the tactics that would be needed to fight Roman legions on floating battlefields. But as winter turned to spring, troubling news began to arrive from the western frontiers of their territory. Octavian's agents were active among the client kingdoms that formed the buffer between Egypt and Italy, offering bribes to wavering rulers and threatening those who remained loyal to Antony. Several minor kings switched sides, taking their ships and soldiers with them, while others adopted a cautious neutrality that was almost as damaging as outright betrayal. More seriously, intelligence reports suggested that Octavian was planning to strike much sooner than anticipated. Rather than spending another year building up his forces, he seemed determined to force a decisive battle while the seasonal campaigning weather was still favorable. This created a dilemma for Antony and Cleopatra. They could meet him with whatever forces they had ready, risking defeat in a hastily planned campaign, or they could retreat deeper into their territory while continuing their preparations, risking the loss of their forward bases and allied kingdoms. The Romans have a saying, Antony remarked during one particularly difficult strategy session, that fortune favors the bold. Perhaps it is time to test whether that applies to us as well. The decision to advance west and meet Octavian's forces in Greek waters was reached after days of intense debate among Cleopatra's advisors and Antony's generals. The risks were enormous. They would be fighting far from their main bases, dependent on supply lines that could be cut by enemy action or bad weather. But the potential rewards were equally great. A victory in the Ionian Sea might convince the wavering kingdoms to rejoin their cause, might even trigger uprisings in Italy itself as Romans tired of civil war rallied to the promise of peace under proven leaders. The final preparations took on an almost religious character as spring advanced toward summer. Priests of Isis blessed the ships as they prepared to sail, while Roman augurs read the flight patterns of birds to determine the most auspicious dates for departure. Soldiers who had served in a dozen campaigns found themselves participating in ceremonies that blended traditions from across the known world, a fitting preparation for what everyone understood might be the last great battle of the Roman Republic. Cleopatra herself presided over the departure ceremonies, appearing once again in the regalia of Isis but now armed with a ceremonial sword that marked her transformation from queen to war leader. Her speech to the assembled troops was brief but powerful, invoking not just their loyalty to her personally but their service to the cause of freedom and justice that she claimed to represent. The Bay of Actium in the summer of 31 BCE was a natural amphitheater where the greatest naval battle of the ancient world was about to unfold. The morning mist rose from waters that had been still as glass, but now began to ripple with the movement of hundreds of ships maneuvering into battle formation. On one side, Octavian's fleet stretched in a disciplined line, their bronze rams catching the early sunlight like spear points. Across the bay, Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces presented a magnificent sight: Egyptian galleys with their distinctive curved prows alongside Roman quinquiremes, their sails displaying the eagles and serpents that symbolized their alliance. Cleopatra stood on the deck of her flagship, a vessel so magnificent that even enemy sailors paused in their preparations to stare. The ship was a masterwork of naval architecture, its hull plated with gold that seemed to turn the very waters around it to liquid fire. Purple sails billowed above decks crowded with the finest soldiers from Egypt and the eastern provinces, while the queen herself wore armor that had been crafted by the same artists who decorated the temples of Alexandria. The night before the battle, she had walked among the ships of her fleet, speaking words of encouragement to sailors and marines who came from every corner of the Mediterranean world. There were Egyptian river pilots who knew every current and sandbar of the Nile, Phoenician navigators whose ancestors had founded Carthage, Greek hoplites whose families had fought at Marathon and Salamis. All had sworn to follow her into battle, and she felt the weight of their loyalty like a physical burden on her shoulders. The battle began with the systematic precision that characterized Roman warfare, but quickly devolved into the chaos that was inevitable when so many ships fought in such confined waters. The air filled with the sound of bronze ramming bronze, the crack of oars snapping under impact, the shouts of officers trying to maintain formation as their carefully planned tactics disintegrated into individual ship-to-ship combat. Cleopatra's Egyptian galleys proved their worth in the opening phases, their superior speed and maneuverability allowing them to dart between the heavier Roman vessels like dolphins among whales. Her marines, armed with the finest weapons that Egyptian craftsmen could produce, proved more than a match for Octavian's soldiers when they could bring them to close combat. For a time, it seemed that tactical skill and individual courage might overcome the numerical advantages that Octavian's fleet enjoyed. But naval battles are won not just by bravery but by endurance, and as the day wore on, the strain began to tell on Antony's forces. His ships were fighting far from their home bases, their crews exhausted by the long campaign that had brought them to this distant bay. Octavian's fleet, by contrast, was fresh and well supplied, supported by shore bases that could provide replacement equipment and reinforcements as needed. The turning point came when a section of Antony's line began to waver under concentrated attack from Octavian's most experienced squadrons. Cleopatra, watching from her flagship, could see that her beloved was in danger of being cut off from his supporting vessels. The Egyptian queen faced a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She could order her ships to fight to the death in a battle that was increasingly hopeless, or she could preserve her forces for future campaigns by breaking off the engagement while escape was still possible. The sight of Cleopatra's ships withdrawing from the battle sent a shockwave through both fleets. Her enemies would later claim that she fled from cowardice, abandoning Antony in his hour of greatest need. But those who knew her understood the terrible calculation she had made: better to save what could be saved than to see her entire fleet destroyed in a gesture of futile heroism. Antony's response to his beloved's withdrawal was immediate and devastating to his own cause. Rather than rallying his remaining ships for a final stand that might yet salvage victory from defeat, he chose to follow Cleopatra, abandoning his fleet and his legions to pursue the woman he loved more than his own glory. His flagship broke from the battle line and sped after the Egyptian vessels, leaving his subordinates to face Octavian's final assault without their commander. The collapse of Antony's fleet was swift and total. Ships that had fought with desperate courage as long as they had leadership found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. Some surrendered, their crews switching sides with the pragmatic opportunism that was common in Roman civil wars. Others fought until they were rammed and sunk, their crews dying with the stoic discipline that had made Roman arms feared throughout the known world. By sunset, Octavian was master of the Bay of Actium and, by extension, of the entire Mediterranean. The naval battle had decided not just the fate of two rival generals but the future of the Roman world. Never again would the empire be divided among competing rulers. Never again would eastern and western provinces follow different policies or serve different masters. The age of the Roman Republic, with its chaos and civil wars, was ending. The age of the empire, with its promise of peace through absolute power, was about to begin. But the human cost of that transformation was only beginning to be counted. In their flight from Actium, Antony and Cleopatra had saved their own lives and those of their immediate followers, but they had abandoned thousands of loyal soldiers and sailors to uncertain fates. The eastern kingdoms that had supported their cause would now face Octavian's vengeance, while the common people who had hoped for a future of peace and prosperity under their rule would instead experience the harsh justice of a conqueror who tolerated no opposition. As night fell over the waters of Actium, the bay was littered with the wreckage of ships and dreams. Octavian's victory was complete, but the final act of the drama was yet to be played. Somewhere to the south, racing across dark waters toward the last refuge of Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony faced the terrible knowledge that they had gambled everything and lost. The question now was not whether they would be defeated, but how they would choose to meet their fate. The stars that had once guided Egyptian astronomers in their calculations of cosmic harmony now looked down on a world that would never be the same. The last independent Hellenistic kingdom would soon fall, the final pharaoh would soon die, and the Mediterranean would become, in truth as well as name, a Roman lake. But the memory of what had been fought for at Actium, the dream of a world where different peoples could live together in partnership rather than subjugation, would survive in the minds of poets and philosophers for generations yet to come. The journey back to Alexandria was a voyage through darkening waters, both literal and metaphorical. Cleopatra's golden flagship, which had gleamed so magnificently at the start of the battle, now seemed to drag through waves that appeared black as pitch beneath an overcast sky. The queen stood at the stern, watching the wake disappear into the gloom behind them, as if she could read in those troubled waters the fate that awaited Egypt and all who had cast their lots with hers. The small fleet that accompanied her, perhaps 60 ships out of the hundreds that had sailed to Actium, represented all that remained of the great Eastern alliance that had once threatened to reshape the Roman world. Egyptian galleys sailed alongside vessels from Rhodes, Cyprus, and the Greek cities of Asia Minor, their crews united now only by shared defeat and the uncertain hope that their homelands might yet be saved from the worst consequences of Octavian's victory. Antony remained in his cabin for much of the voyage, emerging only for brief periods to confer with his remaining officers or to stand silently at the rail, staring toward horizons that no longer held promise. The man who had once commanded legions from Britain to Mesopotamia, who had been hailed as the new Alexander by adoring crowds in a dozen cities, now faced the collapse of everything he had built over 2 decades of brilliant generalship and political maneuvering. When they finally reached the familiar lighthouse of Alexandria, its beacon seeming dimmer than usual in the gray dawnlight, both leaders understood that they were returning not in triumph but to begin preparations for a siege that might be their final battle. The harbor, which had been filled with warships just months before, now seemed almost empty. Word of the defeat at Actium had traveled faster than their ships, carried by merchantmen and fishermen who had witnessed the battle and spread the news across the trade routes of the eastern Mediterranean. The palace, when they reached it, felt different from the magnificent residence they had left so confidently the previous spring. Servants moved through the corridors with the quiet efficiency of those who understood that their world was ending, while courtiers and officials gathered in small groups to whisper about rumors from across the sea. The children, Caesarion now 14 and showing promise of his father's intelligence, the younger ones still too small to fully understand the gravity of their situation, greeted their mother with joy that was shadowed by the adults' barely concealed despair. In the days that followed their return, Cleopatra threw herself into preparations for the defense of her kingdom with the same energy she had devoted to the Actium campaign. But now her efforts had a desperate quality, the frantic activity of someone who knows that time is running out but refuses to surrender without exhausting every possibility. Messages were sent to every corner of Egypt, calling up reserves that had been held back from the Western campaign, gathering supplies for what might be a prolonged siege, reinforcing the ancient fortifications that protected the Nile Delta. The Queen also began to explore alternatives that would have been unthinkable just months before. Secret negotiations were opened with Nubian kingdoms to the south, traditional enemies who might now be willing to ally with Egypt against the greater threat of Roman conquest. Ships were prepared for a possible evacuation that would carry the royal family and their most loyal followers to India, where Ptolemaic diplomatic contacts might provide refuge beyond Octavian's reach. But even as she planned for every contingency, Cleopatra understood that the fundamental mathematics of power had shifted irreversibly at Actium. Egypt's wealth, which had once been her greatest asset in dealing with Roman rivals, was now a liability that made her kingdom an irresistible target. The eastern provinces that had provided military support were now either conquered or seeking accommodation with the victor. The Roman legions in the east, which had formed the backbone of Antony's power, were deserting to Octavian with the practical opportunism that characterized professional soldiers throughout history. Antony's response to their situation was more erratic and ultimately more tragic. Some days he would emerge from his brooding to plan desperate military operations, a march south to rally the Egyptian garrisons, a naval raid on Roman supply lines, a diplomatic mission to Parthia seeking alliance with Rome's greatest enemy. Other days he would sink into a melancholy that seemed to drain all purpose from his movements, speaking of suicide as the only honorable response to the destruction of his career and reputation. The relationship between the two lovers, which had survived years of political pressure and military campaigning, began to show the strain of their impossible situation. They quarreled over strategy, with Antony favoring desperate military gestures while Cleopatra pursued the diplomatic and logistical preparations that might actually preserve something from the wreckage of their cause. They argued about the children's future, with the queen insisting on realistic planning for their safety while Antony clung to fantasies of restored power and vengeful campaigns. Yet even as their relationship deteriorated under stress, both continued to demonstrate the qualities that had made them formidable rulers in better times. Cleopatra maintained the routines of royal administration even as her kingdom prepared for conquest, hearing petitions from ordinary Egyptians, overseeing the distribution of grain from the royal storehouses, ensuring that the ancient religious ceremonies continued to mark the passage of seasons along the Nile. Her presence in the palace and temples of Alexandria provided a sense of continuity that helped prevent panic among the population. Antony, when he could rouse himself from his depression, showed flashes of the strategic brilliance that had made him one of Rome's greatest generals. His plans for the defense of Egypt were professionally competent, taking advantage of the country's natural barriers and the loyalty of troops who had served under him for years. If he had been facing any opponent other than Octavian, who combined military talent with unlimited resources and the momentum of decisive victory, his defensive preparations might have succeeded. As winter approached and intelligence reports confirmed that Octavian was gathering forces for the final campaign, both leaders began to face the possibility that they might not survive to see another spring. Their conversations, when they could manage to speak without quarreling, turned increasingly to questions of legacy and memory. What would historians write about their attempt to create a partnership between East and West? How would their children remember parents who had gambled everything on a dream of reshaping the Mediterranean world? The palace workshops, which had once produced the magnificent costumes and decorations for the donations of Alexandria, now worked on more somber projects. Cleopatra's tomb, which had been under construction for years in the tradition of pharaonic mortuary architecture, was hurriedly completed. Antony, who had never expected to die in Egypt, made arrangements for his own burial in the foreign soil that had become his refuge and his prison. The final months of 31 BCE passed in this strange mixture of feverish activity and growing resignation. Alexandria remained magnificent, its markets still filled with goods from across the known world, its scholars still debating in the courtyards of the great library. But everyone understood that they were living through the last days of an independent Egypt, the end of a story that had begun with the first pharaohs more than 3,000 years before. When word came that Octavian's legions had begun their march eastward, Cleopatra received the news with the composure that had characterized her throughout the crisis. She had done everything possible to preserve her kingdom and protect her people. Now it remained only to face whatever end awaited them with the dignity befitting the last queen of Egypt. Spring came early to Egypt in the year 30 BCE, as if nature itself was eager to witness the final act of the drama that had been building for months. Along the eastern frontier of Cleopatra's kingdom, scouts reported the dust clouds that marked the approach of Octavian's army, 23 legions plus auxiliary forces, perhaps 100,000 men in total, the largest Roman army ever assembled for a single campaign. The report spoke of a military machine of terrifying efficiency, its supply trains stretching back to ports on the Syrian coast, its engineering corps already preparing the siege equipment that would be needed to reduce Egyptian fortifications. In Alexandria, the atmosphere had changed from the desperate hope that had followed Actium to something approaching resigned determination. Cleopatra continued to hold court with all the traditional ceremony, receiving ambassadors and hearing petitions as if the approaching army were merely another diplomatic challenge to be managed through negotiation and compromise. But those who knew her well could see the signs of strain, the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was watching, the way her gaze would drift toward the harbor where her few remaining ships rode at anchor like sleeping birds preparing for flight. The queen's daily routine had taken on an almost ritual quality, as if she were consciously creating memories that would survive the approaching catastrophe. Each morning she would visit the tomb that had been prepared for her, checking on the workmen who were adding final decorations to walls covered with hieroglyphs that told the story of her reign. The tomb was a masterpiece that combined traditional Egyptian mortuary architecture with Hellenistic artistic refinements, a fitting resting place for the last pharaoh. The afternoons were devoted to her children, and these were perhaps the most painful hours of her days. Caesarion, now 15 and tall for his age, had inherited his father Julius Caesar's keen intelligence and his mother's political instincts. He understood better than his younger siblings what was approaching, and Cleopatra could see in his eyes the terrible knowledge that he might not live to inherit the throne for which he had been trained since childhood. The younger children Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus still played in the palace gardens, but their laughter seemed muted, as if they sensed the adult anxiety that pervaded their world. Antony's behavior had become increasingly unpredictable as the crisis deepened. Some days he would emerge from his chambers with something approaching his old energy, drilling the remaining loyal troops, inspecting the harbor defenses, planning raids on Octavian's supply lines that might disrupt the approaching siege. But these periods of activity were followed by longer stretches of withdrawal, when he would disappear into his private apartments and refuse to see anyone except the servants who brought him wine and the occasional messenger bearing reports from the eastern borders. The reports themselves made for grim reading. City after city had opened its gates to Octavian without resistance, their rulers calculating that submission offered better prospects than a futile defense of Antony's losing cause. The island of Cyprus, once a reliable Egyptian possession, had declared for Octavian. The Greek cities of Asia Minor, which had provided ships and men for the Actium campaign, now sent delegations to the Roman conqueror offering tribute and allegiance. Most damaging of all was the defection of the eastern legions that had formed the core of Antony's military power. These were veteran units that had followed him through campaigns from Armenia to Arabia, soldiers whose loyalty had seemed absolute. But professional armies follow success, and with each passing week more cohorts declared for Octavian, taking their eagles and their hard-won military experience to serve the man who now clearly represented the future of Roman power. Cleopatra's response to these desertions was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than raging against the betrayals or wallowing in self-pity, she focused on preserving what could still be saved. secret negotiations were conducted with Octavian's representatives, exploring the possibility of a negotiated surrender that might preserve the lives of her children and maintain some vestige of Egyptian autonomy. The terms offered were harsh but not impossible. Egypt would become a Roman province, but Caesarion might be allowed to live in comfortable exile, and the younger children might be spared if they agreed to be raised in Rome as honored hostages. But these diplomatic feelers met with responses that made clear Octavian's true intentions. The future emperor had no interest in negotiated settlements that might leave potential rivals alive to challenge his authority in future years. Caesarion, as the alleged son of Julius Caesar, represented a particular threat that could never be tolerated. The boy would have to die, along with anyone else who might serve as a focus for opposition to Octavian's rule. As Octavian's army drew closer to the Nile Delta, the pace of events in Alexandria accelerated toward the inevitable climax. The few remaining ships in the royal fleet made ready for immediate departure, loaded with treasure and supplies for what might be a final voyage to unknown refuges beyond the reach of Roman power. The palace guard, reduced to a few hundred men whose loyalty was based on personal devotion rather than political calculation, prepared for a last battle that would be remembered more for its courage than its strategic significance. In the Great Library of Alexandria, scholars worked frantically to preserve the most precious manuscripts and documents, copying essential texts onto papyrus that could be carried to safety or hidden until better times returned. The accumulated wisdom of centuries, Greek philosophy, Egyptian science, Hebrew scriptures, Persian poetry, faced destruction as collateral damage in the Roman civil war that was finally reaching its conclusion on the banks of the Nile. The reports from Octavian's advance guards suggested that the end would come quickly once the siege began. The Roman army that approached Alexandria was not the ragtag collection of hastily recruited legions that had often characterized civil war forces. This was a professional military machine at the height of its power, equipped with the finest siege engines that Roman engineering could devise, supplied by a logistical system that stretched back to Italy, commanded by officers who had learned their trade in the hard school of frontier warfare and civil conflict. Against this force, Cleopatra could field perhaps 10,000 men, most of them Egyptian regulars whose training and equipment were adequate for maintaining internal order but inadequate for facing Roman legions in open battle. The city's walls were ancient and had not been designed to withstand the sophisticated siege techniques that Roman armies had perfected in their conquest of the Mediterranean world. The harbor, once protected by the Great Lighthouse and a chain of fortified islands, was vulnerable to assault by ships and marines who had learned amphibious warfare in campaigns from Britain to the Black Sea. Yet even in the face of overwhelming odds, Cleopatra refused to despair. She was the heir to 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition, the living embodiment of gods whose power was not measured in legions and siege engines but in the eternal rhythms of the Nile and the movements of the stars. If she was to be the last queen of Egypt, she would ensure that her end was worthy of the great story of which she was the final chapter. The siege of Alexandria began on a morning when the Mediterranean winds carried the scent of dust and steel from the Roman camps that now surrounded Egypt's greatest city. From the highest tower of her palace, Cleopatra could see the systematic precision with which Octavian's forces had invested her capital, rings of fortifications that cut off all land approaches, naval patrols that controlled the harbor mouth, siege engines that crept closer to the ancient walls with each passing day. The sight was both terrifying and, in its own way, magnificent. This was Roman military engineering at its finest, the accumulated expertise of centuries of conquest applied to the reduction of the last independent kingdom in the Mediterranean world. The camps were laid out with geometric precision, their streets forming perfect right angles, their defenses calculated to protect the besiegers while providing platforms for the artillery that would soon begin its methodical destruction of Alexandria's fortifications. Within the city, the population had settled into the grim routine of siege warfare. Shops and markets remained open, but goods grew scarce and expensive as the blockade tightened. Families who had lived in Alexandria for generations began to contemplate the possibility that their city might fall, their queen might die, and their world might be transformed beyond recognition. Some prepared for flight to the interior of Egypt, where Roman control might be less absolute. Others resigned themselves to whatever fate awaited them under new masters who had no particular reason to be merciful to the supporters of a defeated cause. The palace itself had taken on the atmosphere of a fortress under siege, though its magnificent decorations and priceless artworks remained in place as if defying the approaching destruction. Cleopatra continued to hold court in the great throne room, receiving reports from her remaining advisors and issuing orders for the city's defense with the same calm authority she had displayed in better times. But everyone understood that these were largely ceremonial gestures, the maintenance of dignity in the face of inevitable defeat. Antony had rallied somewhat as the immediate crisis approached, his soldiers' instincts responding to the presence of an enemy army even when political calculation suggested that resistance was futile. He spent his days inspecting the walls, conferring with the engineers who were reinforcing Alexandria's ancient defenses, and planning sorties that might disrupt the Roman siege works. These activities gave him purpose and helped distract him from the larger tragedy that was unfolding, but they could not disguise the fundamental hopelessness of their situation. The first serious assault came on the 10th day of the siege, when Roman engineers had completed their preparations for a coordinated attack on the weakest section of the city's land walls. The bombardment began before dawn, the deep thrum of catapult arms and the crash of stone balls against masonry creating a rhythm of destruction that continued throughout the morning. By noon, a breach had been opened in the ancient fortifications, and Roman legionaries were advancing in formation toward the gap. The defense of the breach was led by the remnants of Antony's personal guard, veterans of a dozen campaigns who had chosen to remain loyal despite the hopelessness of their cause. They met the Roman assault with the disciplined courage that had made them formidable opponents in better times, fighting with swords and shields among the rubble of the broken wall, selling their lives dearly in a battle they knew they could not win. For several hours, the outcome hung in balance as Roman discipline met Egyptian desperation in brutal close combat. But numbers and training eventually told, as they always did in Roman warfare. The breach was widened by continued bombardment, more legionaries were fed into the assault, and gradually the defenders were pushed back into the city streets beyond the walls. By evening, Roman eagles flew over a section of Alexandria's perimeter, and Octavian's forces had established a foothold within the city itself. That night, in the palace that had been the center of Ptolemaic power for 3 centuries, Cleopatra and Antony faced the final decisions of their lives. The city's fall was now only a matter of time, perhaps days, certainly not weeks. The question was no longer whether they would be defeated, but how they would choose to meet their fate. Would they attempt to flee, seeking refuge in the interior of Egypt or in foreign kingdoms beyond Octavian's immediate reach? Would they surrender, hoping that mercy might be shown to their children if not to themselves? Or would they choose the Roman solution to dishonor, suicide before capture? The discussion between them was conducted with a formality that reflected the gravity of their situation and perhaps the emotional distance that had grown between them during the months of crisis. Antony favored suicide, arguing that death by their own hands was preferable to the humiliation of being paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph. Cleopatra was more concerned with the practical arrangements that might preserve her children's lives, negotiations with the conqueror, the transfer of Egypt's remaining treasures, the possibility that Caesarion might escape to safety even if she could not. Their final night together was spent in the royal chambers where they had shared so many happier hours, but the easy intimacy of their earlier relationship had been replaced by the awkward courtesy of 2 people who had loved each other deeply but now faced circumstances that made such love seem almost irrelevant. Pause. They spoke of their children's futures, of the letters that should be written to potential protectors in distant kingdoms, of the practical arrangements that death makes necessary for those who rule kingdoms and command the loyalty of thousands. The morning brought news that the Roman assault had resumed with renewed vigor, and that other sections of the city wall were now under attack. From her balcony, Cleopatra could see smoke rising from the commercial district where Roman soldiers were systematically looting the warehouses that had made Alexandria wealthy. The great lighthouse, which had guided ships safely to harbor for centuries, was now in Roman hands, its beacon extinguished as a symbol of the city's fall. By midday, it became clear that organized resistance was collapsing throughout the city. The remaining Egyptian forces had been pushed back to the palace quarter, where they made their final stand in streets they had walked as children, defending buildings that held the memories of their entire lives. The sound of battle grew closer with each passing hour, the clash of weapons, the shouts of officers, the screams of wounded men who would receive no mercy from conquerors who had traveled so far to claim their prize. It was then that Antony made his final decision as a Roman general and as a man who had loved too deeply to preserve his own honor intact. Rather than wait for capture in the ruins of the palace, he chose to lead one last charge against the advancing legionaries, not in any hope of victory but as a gesture of defiance that might be remembered when the political consequences of this day had been forgotten. He dressed in his finest armor, took up the sword that had served him in Gaul and Germany and a dozen other campaigns, and walked out to meet his fate in the streets of Alexandria. The final battle was brief but fierce, Roman discipline overwhelming the desperate courage of men who fought with nothing left to lose. When it was over, Antony lay dying in a courtyard not far from the palace, his life ebbing away as the sun set over the city that had been his last refuge and his final battlefield. Word of his death reached Cleopatra as she sat in her private chambers, surrounded by the few servants who had remained loyal to the end. The news of Antony's death removed the last constraints on Cleopatra's own choices. She was now truly alone, the sole surviving leader of a cause that had attracted some of the finest minds and bravest hearts of her generation. The weight of that solitude, combined with the certain knowledge that Octavian's soldiers would soon break down her doors, focused her mind wonderfully on the question of how a queen should die. The final hours of Cleopatra's life unfolded in chambers that had witnessed 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule, rooms where the greatest minds of the ancient world had debated philosophy and mathematics, where kings and queens had planned conquests and negotiated treaties that shaped the destiny of nations. Now those same walls would witness the end of an era, the death of the last pharaoh and the final transformation of the Mediterranean from a collection of independent kingdoms into a unified Roman Empire. Cleopatra's preparations for death were conducted with the same attention to detail that had characterized her approach to statecraft throughout her reign. She bathed in water perfumed with oils from the sacred lotus, symbols of rebirth that connected her final moments to the religious traditions that had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia. Her servants dressed her in robes of the finest linen, dyed with colors that identified her with Isis, the goddess whose protection had been invoked by pharaohs since the earliest dynasties. The makeup that was applied to her face followed ancient formulas that had been preserved in the temples of Memphis and Thebes, each line of kohl an application of gold leaf carrying symbolic meaning that would be understood by the gods who would judge her soul in the afterlife. When the process was complete, she appeared not as a defeated queen awaiting execution, but as a divine ruler prepared to take her place among the immortal pharaohs who had preceded her into eternity. In the hours before the end, messengers arrived with reports from throughout Egypt, final communications from a kingdom that was dissolving around its dying queen. The great city of Memphis had surrendered without resistance, its priests calculating that accommodation with Roman power offered better prospects for preserving the ancient temples and their treasures. Thebes, the religious capital of Upper Egypt, had sent word that its leaders were preparing to welcome Octavian as the new pharaoh, maintaining the fiction that foreign conquest could be transformed into legitimate succession through proper ceremonies and acknowledgement of divine authority. Most painfully, she received intelligence about the fate of her children. Caesarion had been captured while attempting to flee to India, betrayed by tutors who had calculated that Octavian's rewards were more valuable than their loyalty to a fallen dynasty. The boy who might have been the heir to both Caesar's political legacy and Egypt's pharaonic tradition would not live to see his 16th birthday. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus had been taken alive and would be transported to Rome, where their futures would depend on Octavian's calculation of their potential usefulness as symbols of his victory over the East. The knowledge that her children would survive, even as prisoners, provided Cleopatra with a measure of comfort as she contemplated her own approaching end. Royal children had always been political commodities in the Mediterranean world, and there was reason to hope that Octavian would find them more valuable alive than dead. Cleopatra Selene, in particular, might eventually be married to a Roman ally as a way of legitimizing his rule over the eastern provinces that had once looked to Alexandria for leadership. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the sounds of Roman occupation grew louder in the streets beyond the palace walls, Cleopatra made her final arrangements with the calm efficiency that had made her one of the most effective administrators of her age. Letters were written to surviving relatives and allies, explaining her choices and asking for their protection of any Egyptian officials who might be spared in the aftermath of conquest. Instructions were given for the distribution of the royal treasury's remaining contents, ensuring that loyal servants would have resources to begin new lives under Roman rule. The method she had chosen for her death reflected both practical considerations and symbolic meaning that would resonate throughout the ancient world. The asp, the sacred serpent that adorned pharaonic crowns and symbolized the protective power of Egyptian royalty, would deliver the poison that would end her life and complete her transformation from temporal ruler to eternal goddess. The creature had been brought to her chambers in a basket of figs, a final gift from Egypt's fertile fields to the queen who had embodied the land's prosperity and independence. The Roman guards who had been posted outside her chambers received no warning of what was transpiring within. To them, she was simply another defeated enemy leader, perhaps more beautiful and certainly wealthier than most, but ultimately just another obstacle to be removed before Octavian could complete his reorganization of the eastern provinces. They understood nothing of the religious significance of her final acts, nothing of the careful preparation that was transforming her death from a political necessity into a sacred mystery. When Octavian's officers finally broke down the door to her chambers, they found a scene that would be remembered and retold for centuries to come. Cleopatra lay upon her golden couch, dressed in her finest robes and most precious jewelry, her face peaceful in death but retaining the dignity and authority that had made her one of the most formidable rulers of her age. Beside her lay two of her most faithful servants, Iris and Charmian, who had chosen to follow their queen into death rather than face life under foreign masters. The sight that greeted the Roman soldiers was both magnificent and terrible, the final tableau of a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, ended not by the violence of battle but by the quiet determination of a woman who refused to be displayed as a trophy in her conqueror's triumph. The golden serpent that had delivered death to the last pharaoh was never found, despite careful searches of the chambers and questioning of the palace staff. Like the queen herself, it seemed to have passed from the physical world into the realm of legend and myth. Octavian's reaction to the news of Cleopatra's death was complex, mixing frustration at being deprived of his most valuable captive with grudging admiration for the skill with which she had managed her final act of statecraft. The woman who had successfully negotiated with Julius Caesar, who had maintained Egypt's independence for nearly 2 decades, who had come closer than anyone to creating a genuine partnership between East and West, had chosen the terms of her own departure from the stage of history. The funeral that Octavian permitted was a masterpiece of political theater, designed to demonstrate both his respect for Egyptian traditions and his complete control over the kingdom's future. Cleopatra's body was mummified according to ancient rites, her tomb was sealed with ceremonies that acknowledged her divine status as pharaoh, and her death was marked with the full pomp and ceremony that had attended royal burials for millennia. But the priests who conducted these rituals did so as subjects of Rome, and the crowds who mourned their queen's passing did so in a land that would never again be truly independent. In the days following Cleopatra's death, Alexandria began its transformation from the proud capital of an independent kingdom into a provincial city of the expanding Roman Empire. The change was not immediately visible, the great lighthouse continued to guide ships into harbor, the markets remained filled with goods from across the Mediterranean, the scholars in the famous library continued their debates and researches as if the world had not fundamentally altered around them. But beneath the surface continuity, everything had changed irrevocably. Octavian himself arrived in the city 3 days after the queen's death, making his entrance with the calculated ceremony that would characterize his long reign as Rome's first emperor. He was carried through streets lined with Roman legionaries, but he was careful to show respect for Egyptian traditions and sensibilities. His first act was to visit the tomb of Alexander the Great, where he placed a golden crown on the conqueror's preserved remains and spoke words of tribute to the Macedonian hero whose legacy had shaped the entire eastern Mediterranean for more than 3 centuries. The new master of Egypt was 33 years old, exactly the same age as Alexander when he died in Babylon, and the parallel was not lost on observers who understood that they were witnessing another historical turning point of similar magnitude. But where Alexander had conquered through military genius and personal charisma, Octavian had achieved his victory through political calculation, systematic organization, and the patient accumulation of power that would soon make him the most successful ruler in Roman history. The practical arrangements for governing Egypt revealed Octavian's understanding that this conquest was different from Rome's previous territorial acquisitions. Egypt was not a barbarian kingdom to be plundered and forgotten, nor was it a Greek city-state that could be absorbed into Rome's existing system of alliances and client relationships. This was one of the oldest and wealthiest civilizations in the world, with administrative traditions and economic systems that had functioned effectively for millennia. Destroying these institutions would be wasteful, transforming them to serve Roman purposes would be profitable beyond measure. The solution Octavian devised was characteristically subtle and effective. Egypt would be governed not as a senatorial province subject to the traditional Roman system of annual magistrates, but as the personal domain of the emperor himself, administered by carefully chosen prefects who reported directly to Rome. This arrangement prevented ambitious senators from using Egyptian wealth to finance challenges to imperial authority while ensuring that the kingdom's vast resources flowed steadily into the imperial treasury. For the Egyptian people, the transition to Roman rule was managed with sufficient care to prevent the upheavals that might have disrupted the agricultural and commercial systems on which the new province's value depended. Local officials who demonstrated loyalty to the new regime were retained in their positions, religious ceremonies continued according to ancient traditions, and the complex network of irrigation and flood control that sustained Egyptian agriculture was maintained under the supervision of Roman engineers who understood that interference with these systems could trigger famine and rebellion. But the human cost of conquest could not be entirely concealed behind administrative efficiency and political pragmatism. The execution of Caesarion eliminated the last direct threat to Octavian's authority, but it also destroyed the final link between Egypt's Ptolemaic past and any possible future restoration of independence. The boy who had been raised to believe he was the son of Julius Caesar died in Alexandria's streets, killed by soldiers who acted on orders that allowed no room for mercy or sentiment. The fate of Cleopatra's surviving children illustrated both the cruelty and the calculated political intelligence that characterized Octavian's approach to consolidating power. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, the sons who had been proclaimed kings of vast eastern territories during the donations of Alexandria ceremony, disappeared from historical records soon after their arrival in Rome. Whether they died from disease, accident, or deliberate elimination, their deaths removed potential focal points for future resistance to Roman rule in the provinces they had been designated to inherit. Cleopatra Selene's survival reflected her greater value as a political asset in Octavian's long-term planning for the organization of the Roman Empire. The daughter of the last queen of Egypt was eventually married to Juba II, the scholarly king of Mauritania, in a ceremony that symbolically united African territories under Roman supervision while providing the appearance of continuity with pre-conquest political arrangements. Her children would carry Ptolemaic blood, but they would be raised as loyal clients of Rome, their royal heritage transformed from a source of potential rebellion into a legitimizing factor for imperial rule. The transformation of Alexandria itself proceeded with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all of Octavian's administrative initiatives. The Great Library, which had been the intellectual center of the Hellenistic world, was reorganized to serve Roman scholarly interests while maintaining its reputation as a center of learning and research. Roman architects began planning modifications to the city's public spaces, adding forums and amphitheaters that would provide appropriate venues for the civic ceremonies that bound provincial populations to the imperial system. The harbor, which had been the economic lifeline that connected Egypt to the broader Mediterranean world, was restructured to serve the needs of Roman commerce and military logistics. New warehouses were constructed to handle the vast quantities of grain that would now flow from Egyptian fields to Roman tables, while naval facilities were expanded to accommodate the warships that would ensure continued Roman control over the eastern Mediterranean sea lanes. Perhaps most significantly, the religious landscape of Egypt began to evolve in ways that reflected the new political reality while preserving enough traditional elements to maintain popular acceptance. The cult of Isis, which had been intimately connected to the legitimacy of Ptolemaic rule, was gradually transformed into a mystery religion that could flourish throughout the Roman Empire without challenging imperial authority. The goddess who had been embodied by Cleopatra became a symbol of personal salvation and spiritual transformation that appealed to Romans as well as Egyptians, her worship spreading from Alexandria to Rome itself and eventually to the furthest provinces of the empire. The economic integration of Egypt into the Roman system proceeded with remarkable speed and efficiency, testament to the organizational capabilities that would make Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, the most successful ruler in Roman history. Egyptian grain began flowing to Rome in quantities that transformed the capital's food supply, while Egyptian gold and silver provided the monetary resources that financed the military forces needed to defend and expand the empire's frontiers. But the conquest of Egypt represented more than just the addition of another wealthy province to Rome's territorial holdings. With Cleopatra's death and the absorption of her kingdom, the last remnant of Alexander the Great's empire had finally disappeared, ending a historical epoch that had begun with the Macedonian conquest of Persia more than 3 centuries earlier. The Hellenistic Age, with its fusion of Greek culture and Eastern traditions, its competing kingdoms and ambitious rulers, its remarkable achievements in science, philosophy, and the arts, had come to a definitive end. The Mediterranean world that emerged from Octavian's victory at Actium and conquest of Egypt would be fundamentally different from anything that had existed before. For the first time in history, the entire basin would be under the control of a single power, its diverse peoples and cultures united under Roman law and imperial administration. The age of independent kingdoms and city-states, of shifting alliances and constant warfare, of cultural competition and political fragmentation, was over. The age of the Roman Empire, with its promise of peace through strength and unity through submission, had begun. The story of Cleopatra's final years did not end with her death in the palace chambers of Alexandria. In the decades and centuries that followed, her memory became something more complex and enduring than the political reality of her reign, a symbol that meant different things to different peoples, a legend that evolved with each generation's understanding of power, love, and the price of independence in a world increasingly dominated by imperial authority. In Rome itself, the official version of events was carefully crafted to serve Octavian's political needs as he transformed himself from military dictator to Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Cleopatra was portrayed as a dangerous seductress who had corrupted noble Roman generals through exotic luxury and feminine wiles, a foreign queen whose ambitions threatened the very foundations of Roman virtue and tradition. This portrayal served the useful purpose of explaining why such capable leaders as Julius Caesar and Mark Antony had made decisions that seemed to contradict their earlier careers and loyalties. But even in Rome, the official narrative could not entirely suppress admiration for the courage and intelligence that Cleopatra had displayed throughout her reign and especially in its final crisis. Roman historians, writing for audiences that included educated Greeks and other Eastern subjects of the empire, found themselves acknowledging the genuine political and intellectual accomplishments that had made her one of the most effective rulers of her age. The woman who had maintained Egypt's independence for nearly 2 decades, who had successfully negotiated with the most powerful Romans of her era, who had chosen death over humiliation, commanded a respect that transcended political propaganda. In Egypt itself, the memory of the last queen became intertwined with broader dreams of independence and cultural continuity that would persist throughout the centuries of Roman rule. The priests who maintained the ancient temples preserved traditions that connected their rituals to the pharaonic past, while scholars in Alexandria continued to study texts that had been written when Egypt was the greatest power in the eastern Mediterranean. These guardians of Egyptian culture understood that they were preserving something more than academic knowledge. They were maintaining the intellectual and spiritual foundations that might someday support another renaissance of Egyptian civilization. The transformation of Cleopatra's historical identity into literary and artistic inspiration began remarkably quickly after her death, as poets and playwrights throughout the Roman Empire found in her story themes that resonated with their audience's understanding of love, power, and tragic necessity. The Greek poets of Alexandria, writing under Roman rule but drawing on centuries of literary tradition, created works that portrayed their last queen as a figure of heroic tragedy, a woman whose greatness was measured not by her political success but by the dignity with which she met her inevitable defeat. These early literary treatments established patterns that would influence artistic representations of Cleopatra for millennia to come. She became a figure who embodied the eternal tension between East and West, between feminine intuition and masculine logic, between the claims of love and the demands of duty. Her relationship with Antony was transformed from a political alliance with romantic complications into one of history's great love stories, a passion so intense that it led to the destruction of empires and the reshaping of the ancient world. The religious dimensions of Cleopatra's legacy proved even more durable than her political or literary significance. The cult of Isis, which had been intimately connected to Ptolemaic rule and which Cleopatra had embodied in her public appearances, spread throughout the Roman Empire with remarkable speed and persistence. Temples dedicated to the Egyptian goddess appeared in cities from Britain to the Black Sea, attracting devotees who found in her mysteries a spiritual satisfaction that traditional Roman religion could not provide. For many of these worshippers, Isis remained connected to the memory of Egypt's last queen, the mortal woman who had been the goddess's final earthly representative before the ancient kingdom lost its independence. This connection gave the cult a subtle political dimension that Roman authorities found difficult to suppress without creating martyrs and potentially driving the movement underground. The worship of Isis thus became a way for people throughout the empire to maintain a connection to pre-Roman traditions and values while nominally accepting imperial authority. The scholarly tradition of Alexandria, which had made the city one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world, also preserved elements of Cleopatra's legacy that transcended the immediate political consequences of her defeat. The astronomical and mathematical knowledge that had flourished under Ptolemaic patronage continued to develop under Roman rule, but scholars maintained awareness that they were working in traditions that had reached their height when Egypt was ruled by philosopher queens who could discuss geometry with Euclid and astronomy with the successors of Aristarchus. As the Roman Empire itself began to experience the pressures that would eventually lead to its transformation and decline, Cleopatra's memory acquired new political significance as an example of resistance to imperial authority. Provincial leaders who chafed under Roman taxation and cultural domination found inspiration in the story of a ruler who had maintained her kingdom's independence for 2 decades against overwhelming odds, who had negotiated with Rome's greatest leaders as an equal, who had chosen death over submission to foreign rule. The Byzantine Empire, which inherited the eastern provinces of Rome and maintained Greek cultural traditions while adopting Christian religious practices, developed its own version of Cleopatra's legacy that emphasized her role as a patron of learning and the arts. Byzantine historians, writing in Greek for audiences that included many subjects whose ancestors had been ruled by Ptolemaic kings, portrayed the last queen of Egypt as a tragic figure whose fall represented the end of an age when Greek culture had been politically independent and intellectually dominant in the eastern Mediterranean. The Islamic conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE brought new perspectives on Cleopatra's historical significance, as Arab historians and geographers encountered the physical remains of Ptolemaic civilization and the literary traditions that had preserved memories of the dynasty's final ruler. Islamic scholars, working with Greek and Coptic sources that had been preserved in Egyptian monasteries and libraries, developed their own interpretations of Cleopatra's story that emphasized her wisdom, her political skill, and her tragic end as a cautionary tale about the dangers of political overreach and the inevitable decline of earthly kingdoms. The medieval Islamic version of Cleopatra's legend would prove remarkably durable, influencing European understanding of the historical figure when renewed contact between Christian and Muslim civilizations made Arabic sources available to Western scholars. These accounts portrayed the last queen of Egypt as a figure of almost mythical wisdom and learning, a woman who had commanded not only political and military resources but also magical knowledge that connected her to the deepest mysteries of ancient Egyptian civilization. Perhaps most remarkably, Cleopatra's memory survived the complete transformation of the Mediterranean world that occurred with the rise of Christianity and the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Early Christian writers, despite their hostility to pagan religious practices and their general disapproval of powerful women who wielded political authority, found themselves unable to ignore the historical significance of the last pharaoh. Some portrayed her as a cautionary example of the dangers of pride and ambition, while others acknowledged her intellectual accomplishments and the dignity of her final actions. The preservation of classical literary traditions in Byzantine and Islamic libraries ensured that detailed accounts of Cleopatra's life and reign remained available to later generations of scholars and artists, even as the political and cultural contexts that had originally shaped these accounts became increasingly remote. When Renaissance humanists began to rediscover classical antiquity, they found in the story of Egypt's last queen a wealth of material that could be adapted to serve their own artistic and intellectual purposes. The enduring fascination with Cleopatra's story reflects something deeper than mere historical curiosity or artistic inspiration. In her life and death, people of many different cultures and historical periods have found a mirror for their own struggles with the challenges of leadership, the complications of love and duty, the difficulty of maintaining independence in a world dominated by great powers, and the question of how to meet inevitable defeat with dignity and grace. The last queen of Egypt died in Alexandria more than 2,000 years ago, but her memory continues to resonate because the fundamental human experiences that shaped her story, ambition and disappointment, love and loss, the weight of responsibility and the approach of death, remain constant across the centuries. In contemplating her final years, we are reminded not only of the grandeur and tragedy of the ancient world, but also of the eternal qualities that define human greatness regardless of the historical circumstances in which it must be expressed. As our journey through the final years of Cleopatra's extraordinary life draws to a close, let yourself settle more deeply into the quiet comfort of the present moment. The drama of ancient Alexandria, with its palaces and battles, its love and loss, its triumph and tragedy, begins to fade like a distant dream, leaving only the eternal rhythms that connect all human experience across the centuries. Feel your breathing slow and deepen as you let go of the weight of empires and the burden of crowns. The last queen of Egypt found peace at the end of her struggle, and so can you, here in this moment, freed from the pressures and anxieties that fill your waking hours. The Mediterranean waters that carried Cleopatra's ships to their final battles now reflect only starlight, calm and eternal as the cosmos itself. In your mind's eye, see the lighthouse of Alexandria one final time, its beacon no longer guiding warships to battle but offering safe harbor to travelers seeking rest. Let that light guide you toward the deep, restorative sleep that awaits, where dreams of queens and emperors give way to the profound rest that heals both body and spirit. The last pharaoh sleeps peacefully in her golden tomb, and you too can find that same serene rest, that same release from the struggles of the waking world. Sleep now, knowing that the story continues in your dreams, where all the great tales of history blend into the eternal narrative of human hope and endurance. Rest well, and let the ancient peace of Egypt's timeless desert carry you safely through the night. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.